Hello, so today we're going to talk about Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things by George Lakoff or Lakoff. Not sure how it's pronounced. I'm probably going to use both pronunciations throughout this video. This is a book that incorporates cognitive science, philosophy, and linguistics in order to make a rather interesting argument. The book is separated into three sections. Also, this is quite a technical book, so the review might be a little bit abstract as well. So the book's separated into three sections. The first section, Lakoff discusses categorization, the way it works, and what he argues is what most people use, or what is kind of the use in Western thought, is necessary and sufficient conditions, and he argues that's not really how we categorize things. We categorize things in terms of prototypical conditions. More on that later. And the second section is some broader implications for philosophy. Lakoff argues that since most of philosophy is based on sort of implicit understanding of the categorization in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, it collapses on itself, and instead we need a new understanding for philosophy. And the third section, which we won't be discussing at all, is case studies which provide examples that help illustrate his points. Okay, so necessary and sufficient conditions are kind of the baseline starting point. And what a necessary condition is something cannot be a member of a category unless it has this condition. So, for example, a necessary condition might be for something to be considered a farm animal, it must be sold by farmers, right? But a farmer might also sell his car, right? So, and his car is not a farm animal. So while it might be a necessary condition, that alone is not enough to put it in a group. A sufficient condition, if all sufficient conditions are met, something belongs to a category in a guaranteed way. So something that people think of as a sufficient condition is if something has hair, then it's alive, and there's a few more. It's a mammal. Okay? And so the way most categorization is done in Western thought is you are looking for these groupings of necessary and sufficient conditions. And if you meet all the conditions, you belong to the group 100%. Okay? And it's a very binary sense of belonging, where it's either like a light switch. You either belong or you don't belong. Okay, prototypical conditions instead have what's known as radial categories. Okay? And radial categories can belong to something in a matter of degrees. So you can be either really in the category or like just kind of in the category. Which is, it's a bit abstract. So kind of a way of looking at how we have prototypical conditions in terms of the way we think is there was this study done where they asked people to rate in the United States, to rate how similar is Mexico to the United States, and they asked a separate group, how similar is the United States to Mexico? So notice the difference is the directionality. What they found is people rated Mexico as being more similar to the United States than they voted the United States being similar to Mexico. And this effect is reversed if you ask people from Mexico about the United States. And the idea is what people do is they view their own country as the prototype. Okay? And they think that every other thing that belongs to that, in this case nations, are quite similar to the prototype. And they will rate them as being more similar than the prototype being similar to that. So if we think in radial categories, smack in the middle is whatever country you're from, and then going out, being less members of the category is every other country. So if I, for example, say dog, in your head you actually probably think of a particular dog. And you summon this into your mind. This is the ICM, or internal cognitive model, of dog. Okay? So, what happens with this? What we have is prototypical conditions, where in our mind we have this prototype, or ICM, of one particular case that really represents the thing, and we judge something to be a member of that based on how similar it is. So, an example I like to use from the book is this notion of lie. Okay? With necessary and sufficient conditions, something is a lie, or someone tells a lie if they tell you something that's untrue. It's a sufficient condition. And perhaps you want to make a more nuanced thing, but Lakoff argues this doesn't really capture the way we use the word lie or the way we use the idea. Okay? An obvious example is a white lie. In a white lie, you are telling something that's untrue, but most people don't really consider it a lie in the way they do other things that are lies. For example, if someone tells a white lie, it is perhaps inappropriate to yell at them that you're lying to me, right? Whereas someone if tells like a prototypical lie, that might be appropriate. Okay, and the difference is that there's actually something more important than something being false in terms of lie in prototypical conditions, and that's the intent to deceive. When you are telling someone a white lie, your intention is not to deceive them. It's to smooth things over socially. And so that is one of the reasons why we don't really think of white lies as being lies in the same sense. And so what Lakoff argues, and he appeals to, I forget the name of the person who did the study, he cites a lot of other people's work to make this large cohesive argument. But what they say is there are three conditions that are important for a lie. And the least important one is something actually being untrue. Okay, the most important is the speaker's belief that what they are saying is untrue. Okay, so if I say your car is missing from the parking lot and I think it's there, then, but it turns out it actually is missing, I would still be saying I think is untrue. Also, the second condition is the intent to deceive, is also more important than something being a lie. And so what you have is, if you see a lie as being something that is out of line or violates you, and you are using these three prototypical conditions, it becomes easier to understand why when someone tells you something that is untrue, but they think it to be true, and they think they are informing you or helping you, you generally don't get mad at them, or it would be inappropriate for you to get mad at them. Conversely, if someone thinks something is false, and they tell you it's true, but it turns out it's actually true, and this person was trying to deceive you, it's still appropriate to get angry at them, even if they were turned out to be telling the truth. So, for example, if I say someone keyed your car, because I'm trying to get a rise out of you and get you to run out to the parking lot and check out your car, and I don't think your car's been keyed, but it turns out someone actually keyed your car, and you find out that I didn't actually know that your car was keyed, it would still be appropriate to get mad at me. Okay, so we think in terms of prototypical conditions, rather than necessary and sufficient conditions. Another example is like the category of bachelor, where you see that the sufficient condition is unmarried man, but excludes there are obvious examples of unmarried men that do not appropriately fit the term bachelor. Right? An example is priests, because the eligibility to be married is an important aspect of bachelor, but it doesn't fit well with the necessary and sufficient conditions. Instead, we have prototypical understanding of bachelor, which has like desire to get married, heterosexual, unmarried, these sorts of things. Interestingly, like the term confirmed bachelor refers to someone who's gay, but they are not a bachelor in the same sense. In a prototypical sense, they do not closely resemble the ICM of bachelor. Okay, so the second section of the book talks about how in philosophy there is this objectivist paradigm that kind of has this idea that we can form this God's eye view of reality, looking down and perfectly capture reality in propositions or statements about the world. Okay, if you look at it with any degree or any amount of time, you'll notice that in these propositions, you are saying things that belong to categories, right? If the categories are necessary and sufficient conditions, then you can put things into groups in like a light switch sort of way, which is either they entirely belong or they don't belong at all. And this allows you to make statements about reality that are either true or false in really hard, unequivocal ways. Unfortunately, this isn't how categorization is done conceptually. And so if you don't have this, you can no longer have an objectivist sort of telling about reality, is what Lakoff argues. You cannot properly capture in language a God's eye view of reality in terms of propositions, nor can our cognition properly capture reality in a God's eye point of view. This is a lot to unpack in terms of his examples, and I will not try to do it here, but what this has a big implication for metaphysics in terms of what the project is, and sort of the direction Lakoff argues that we need to take is an experientialist accounting of metaphysics. So one common objection to Lakoff's sort of anti-objectivist point is like, oh, you're just a relativist. And Lakoff's like, there are different types of relativists, okay? There's the anything goes, anything's true type of relativist. That's not what I am. Instead, I am looking for empirical groundings for things, but you cannot properly capture, with a God's eye view, reality. Okay. It's quite a lot to unpack. And I think it's pretty significant in philosophy, and this book has developed my kind of understanding for metaphysics a lot. I was always kind of unsettled by people thinking that they could perfectly describe reality, and I just thought it was a project that was impossible. And Lakoff kind of gives what I think is a fairly good accounting of why it is impossible. But let's get into the ratings. So for utility, I gave it a 4. It perhaps should score lower. For a person who's not interested in philosophy, this is like perhaps kind of the bottom of the barrel in terms of usefulness. Although there are some interesting things that I think can develop your views and perhaps interesting ways towards the start when you understand how you're categorizing things in your mind. An example being the idea of lie. If you are understanding lie as having prototypical conditions, then you can perhaps more appropriately get angry at people when they tell you something that is true, but in such a way that they are trying to deceive you, right? Because if someone's trying to deceive you, even if they say stuff that's literally true, what they're doing is still out of line and inappropriate, right? And similarly, you should perhaps not get mad at someone who accidentally tells you something that's false. So there's like little bits of usefulness, but the majority of why it's scoring a 4 is if you're in the project of philosophy or trying to construct a worldview. I think this book is tremendously useful. If you exclude the philosophical example, maybe this scores a 2. Pretty low. It's a thick book. It's not an easy read. It's like not entertaining in the conventional sense. It's just entertaining in an interesting sense. So 4 or 2, depending on your interests. For novelty, I gave it a 9. And this score is a little hard for me to defend, but I will take a crack at it. So generally speaking, with novelty, I kind of have 2 ways of thinking about it. How new the idea is, or how out of alignment it is with the current, like, let's say, what's out there. In that case, this book actually scores tremendously high. It disagrees with a lot of Western philosophy, and I think it disagrees in a really robust way that is difficult to, and it has really broad implications. But the second aspect of novelty is, how bad is it if you don't read it? Like, did you like miss out on something really big? And if you don't have this kind of philosophical interest, I really don't think you miss out on anything not reading this. It's really big, it's thick, it's not the easiest, and I don't think it provides much utility, so missing out is like, eh. For entertainment, I gave it a 3. There are large parts that are just very technical, and while having like aha moments, like these eureka moments, are entertaining, I don't think it balances out that this is fairly an abstract book and can be a bit of a slog at times. Style, I give it a 6.5. I think, given what it is, the author does a pretty good job. I've read some of his other books. I thought they were well written as well. For readability, I gave it a 5. And this is like one where they got a 5 because I think they did a really good job. Lakoff did a really good job with what the concepts he was trying to put forward, but it is not easy to read. It's not an easy read if you do not have a background in philosophy or linguistics. When he gets to the section on philosophy, you're going to have a hard time if you've never heard of the word like metaphysics or objectivist or subjective or relative or like all these things. I think it's going to be quite difficult. I personally had quite a difficult time when he got to, in the third section, he talks about case studies, and like some of them are quite dense linguistic studies, and I do not have a background in linguistics, and those were quite of a slog. So readability is not an easy read, should perhaps score way lower. I thought he did a pretty good job making the concepts accessible, as well as sufficiently scaffolding ideas so that he can make the larger, broader argument later. Like, I think the first, 200 pages are just talking about prototype, or like just the way we think in terms of prototype and experiential thinking and radial categories and this type of stuff. And I think he does a pretty good job outlining that. For interesting, I gave it a 9.5. This book was tremendously interesting for me. It's a book that's, you're thinking about the way you think, and maybe this scores a bit high because I don't think it applies to too many other people. But when I was looking at the problem is that I think this book should score quite high overall. And my rating system is really just kind of like kicking it pretty hard, I think. But the book, I don't think is particularly useful, and I don't think is particularly easy, which tends to give it a lower score. I do think it was tremendously interesting, especially if you have any sort of background in philosophy and metaphysics, or like kind of the big picture answers, like how's it all work. If those are interesting to you, I think this book's tremendous. And so I scored it a 9.5, which gives an overall rating of 6.17, which is fairly high. In terms of recommendations, for most people, I would not recommend this book for reasons I've already stated. I think it's difficult. Just trying to summarize it is a bit difficult because there's so much going on. It took me quite a while to read this book because slogging through... I felt like I had to think about stuff after every 2 to 3 pages I read, and so it's not really the best book to just slog through 20 pages at a time, or 30 or 50. So I would recommend it to people who have an interest in philosophy, though, and have an interest in kind of the big picture type of philosophers like Kant and Hegel, which are trying to correctly capture the world and that sort of thing. I think that Lakoff really highlights why an objectivist type of approach is just doomed to fail. Which isn't to say reality's not a particular way. Like, reality is however it is, but this notion that we can capture and describe it in propositions is just it's kind of insane, because every proposition has kind of the form of, this object belongs to this category. It's kind of how, like, Socrates is a man as a proposition, is either true or false 100% of the time in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. But the problem is like sometimes this notion of man can be difficult. If you are looking at it from like a gender basis, if you say anything with a Y chromosome is a man, what happens if you have an XXY chromosome? Or anything with two X chromosomes is not a man. Then what happens if you have XXY? It's like, oh, well, it's difficult. And then from like an evolutionary perspective, there's... If you go back one generation, is that a man? If you go back two, is that a man? Or like, this time, man referring to human. And you keep doing this, you keep asking this question. At what point is it not a man? And it's like, if you go back 10,000 generations or whatever, you have like a fish. And can you clearly describe with necessary and sufficient conditions the exact light switch point where the person before them was not a man? No. You can just, with prototypical conditions, it's much easier to sort of explain this where it's like a light switch where they're just slowly becoming less and less of a man. And there's no one point where you just like flip the switch, suddenly they're a man. And it's these sorts of things, it's like, yeah, I find it tremendous. If you have an interest in philosophy and like those types of arguments, then this book's really interesting. Also, language-based philosophy, this book's interesting. But if you're not there, wouldn't recommend it. As far as discussion goes, did anyone get this far in the video? It's a bit abstract. I don't think anyone's getting this far. So if you got this far, shout out to you. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe if, YouTube stuff, and have a good day.